David Tikau, maybe I'll invite our speakers to turn your cameras on, and David Tikau, if you don't mind starting the meeting for us.
Kia ora, Jane. Ti hei mauri ora, e te atua no te kororia, te papa I waho nei tēnā koe, nā mana whenua o New Tirene, tēnā koutou. Nau mai taiti mai ki a tātou hui topa, nō reira tēnā koutou. Haere mai ki te whānau ai ki ahi tereria, Kristy, Roa, ko Sam, me Nicole. E karakia, unu hia, ki te uru tapu nui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara tākata. Koia rā e rongo. Whakaria ake ki runga, kia tīna, aumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
Hi,
Kia ora.
Kia ora, David. Thank you and welcome everyone. Thanks to David Tikau, who is a member of the board of the Centre for Sustainable Finance. Tēnā koutou katoa, my name is Jo Kelly and I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Sustainable Finance, Toi Tū Tahua. Welcome to the second part of our 5-part webinar series, Unpacking Global Trends in Taxonomies. As many of you are aware, the Centre was established to accelerate progress towards an inclusive, equitable and sustainable financial system in Aotearoa, New Zealand. One of our strategic priorities is advancing common definitions, data and standards for sustainable finance that are both locally applicable and internationally aligned. Simply projecting a clean green image isn't enough anymore. Aotearoa, New Zealand is reliant on international capital and export markets, and we need to tell a robust, credible sustainability story. Underpinning this story is a financial system that is resilient in a low emissions global economy. With over 30 taxonomies emerging globally, we need to understand how to harness their power to direct capital to sustainable economic activity while leapfrogging the lessons hard learned in other regions. The purpose of this series is to help us understand how to do that by hearing from local and international experts on lessons from other jurisdictions. In our first webinar earlier this month, we started with the most important question: would a sustainable finance taxonomy benefit New Zealand Inc? Our panel included today's moderator, David Woods, who is a board member of both the Centre and New Zealand Green Investment Finance, Pip Best from EY, David Lewis from Novus Consulting, and Isabel Bronquier, who is a Senior Policy Advisor on Sustainable Finance for Ministry for the Environment. They outlined a number of reasons why undertaking a taxonomy process is beneficial in the New Zealand context, not least that there is a groundswell of taxonomies globally, and at minimum we need to determine where we sit relative to those. More optimistically, because once we agree on what good looks like for New Zealand, it will be easier to direct capital in that direction. You can watch a recording of that webinar on our website, and we'll put a link in the chat. Today, we are hearing from our colleagues in Australia who have been on an accelerated journey of answering the same question for Australia. They will share some of the key lessons and insights they've gained from their industry-led taxonomy process, which has recently become a formal industry-government partnership. You may also be interested to join the upcoming ASFI webinar on Tuesday, the 30th of May, which shares key insights from the Canadian taxonomy process. Follow ASFI on LinkedIn and you will find a registration link there, and we'll also include it in the chat. Our panel today will again be expertly moderated by David Woods, and you will have a chance to ask questions, so please feel free to put those in the chat. Please don't put them in the Q&A. And I also just want to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded. At the end of the session, we will put a survey link in the chat, and we will also email it to everyone who attends here today. We would very much appreciate hearing your views via that survey. The results will inform the early design discussions for a New Zealand taxonomy, which the Centre is currently undertaking in partnership with MFE. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today and welcome you all. So we all know David Woods, our moderator, who is, as I said, a professional director, deputy chair of New Zealand Green Investment Finance, a member of the Centre's board and also of the board of the Impact Investing Network. Kristy Graham is, welcome Kristy, is not only great collaborator to the Centre over the past 18 months, but is also the Executive Officer of the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, which is a similar organisation to the Centre in Australia. With a background in sustainable finance, Kristy established the Australian government's first impact investment fund and was also a special advisor on the Prime Minister's Social Impact Investing Taskforce in 2020. Sam Hurley, welcome Sam, is the Director of the Sustainable Finance Unit at the Australian Treasury, which is supporting the development of the Australian government's sustainable finance strategy. And Nicole Yazbek-Martin is Head of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Project. Previously, Nicole has managed sustainable investments in banking and private equity and worked in the public service on the design, development and review of key climate change and environmental policies and markets. So welcome everyone, welcome to our guest today. And David, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Joe, and thank you everybody for being with us today. We're looking forward to this. As Joe said, we started a couple of weeks ago with a first session on what a sustainable finance taxonomy was and what problems it was going to solve. And as we start our geographic journey around people who've addressed this issue, we chose to come first to Australia because the visible progress in Australia in the last year has been very remarkable. So perhaps I could ask each of the speakers to just give a few minutes on what they see as the problem a taxonomy will solve, and then why Australia chose to do its own, because unlike with the Pavlova and Sam Neill, Australia really did get there first with the taxonomy. So Kristy, perhaps you'd like to go.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So thanks very much for having us. As Joe said, we've worked really closely with the Centre for Sustainable Finance since we were both established around the same time. And the taxonomy has been a priority project right from the beginning. It was identified by both our members from right across the finance sector, from banking, investors, insurance, as a set of credible definitions that would allow them to allocate the capital that's needed to Australia's transition and to sustainable activities. And the fact that taxonomies are being developed in a range of jurisdictions that weren't necessarily fit for purpose in the Australian context because of the transition challenge we have and because of the way that our economy is made up, meant that all of our members, as well as at that time regulators, were very keen for ASFI to start the work on a taxonomy. So in terms of what is a sustainable finance taxonomy and what problems it's meant to solve, ultimately, they're sets of definitions that talk to the sustainability credentials of particular economic assets, activities and investment products or financial products. And that consistent set of definitions allows investors and banks and other parts of finance to be comparing across sustainability credentials of different investment opportunities, and ultimately allows taxonomies to be a tool for the allocation of capital towards those objectives. The last thing I'll just add on why did Australia choose to do its own taxonomy is that we're not starting from scratch. So interoperability is critically important, and we're not the first. As Joe mentioned in the introduction, there's 30 taxonomies in various stages of development. And even through this first phase of the work, we've had really strong and engaging relationships with ASEAN, with Singapore, the Canadians, EU, UK, to learn not just from the process, but also learn a lot more about the frameworks and where they're landing on different elements of the taxonomy. So Australia has some different challenges, and transition will be a real focus of our taxonomy. And we can get into some more details about where some of those other differences might be. But just to say, we are developing our own taxonomy, but working heavily and closely with those other jurisdictions that have developed or are developing taxonomies.
Thank you, Kristy. Now, Sam, it's interesting for us in New Zealand to see how the Treasury has so clearly stepped up to the plate and become part of this project. Why did Treasury feel that that was something it should do, and why does Treasury feel Australia needs its own taxonomy?
Thanks, David, and thanks, David and Joe, for the warm welcome. It's good to be with you here today and to be chatting again with Kristy and Nicole. We've spent a lot of time discussing sustainable finance in Australia and the taxonomy projects, in particular over the last few weeks, and I'm sure that's going to continue. So it's nice to be with you too as well today. there's probably a long answer to that question, David, and it's related to the question of why did we choose to do the taxonomy specifically. I think Kristy's outlined the dynamics here really well. I think just one thing to note is that while the decisions might look new, or like there has been a kind of, not a sudden shift, but a pretty marked step up in ambition, I think that shift has actually been underway for quite a while, and the decision around a taxonomy or about leaning forward a little bit more on sustainable finance hasn't sprung out of nowhere and hasn't been taken in isolation. So I think there's been a real focus, a growing focus for quite a long time now on how the shift towards mainstreaming sustainability in global capital markets impacts upon firms, financial institutions, investment in Australia, and in particular, like our ability to align with the targets that are being set globally, to communicate that effectively, to enable a conversation about the sustainability related attributes of Australian firms and Australia as an investment destination. So that's been an influential line of thinking for a long time now. And, you know, when you see the developments that have been happening in Europe and Asia and similar economies like Canada, and the work that's been underway in places like New Zealand, it's natural, I think, for Australia, for our financial regulators and for Treasury to ask, you know, what's our approach going to be here? Are we prepared to sit back and let these rules be drawn up internationally without, you know, any concerted attempt to influence that or to get our head around how the frameworks are going to develop here? I think the natural answer to that question has been no. So the question that's remained is, what does Treasury's engagement in that process look like? Just on that note, I mean, it's worth noting the previous government's decision to make the firm commitment when it did to net zero was heavily couched and communicated in terms of needing to send that clear message on global capital markets and needing to ensure that Australia was aligned and laying a strong foundation for attracting the investment that we need to reach net zero. And our Secretary, Stephen Kennedy, gave a big speech, or what I thought was a big speech anyway, on this topic in November 2021, talking about that shift that we've been seeing internationally, foreshadowing the sort of change to a much more active approach and the need for Treasury and for economic policymakers generally to lean into this debate. So that's all just by way of introduction to say, I think this shift has actually been underway for quite a while, and Treasury, increasingly, the Treasurer and government sees a key role for Treasury as the kind of preeminent economic advisor to government in Australia, engaging in detail with some of these policy issues and being at the forefront of some of the solutions that we're seeing come together now. Now, obviously, you know, we're now part of what is a much more front-footed approach across government on climate and green finance generally. And I think it's safe to say from a policymaker's point of view, from a financial regulator point of view, from a market participant point of view, there's lots of alignment and interest and appetite and focus on some of the potential benefits of doing this taxonomy work and of, you know, engaging more proactively across the board on sustainable finance generally. You know, market participants led by ASFI have been very clear on the value of some of this work. Our regulators have been more engaged for several years now on this set of issues. They can see the potential value of a taxonomy and other frameworks that provide a bit more clarity and certainty. And certainly, you know, here at Treasury, we see a taxonomy as playing potentially a really important role in complementing a range of other reforms in sustainable finance, including the disclosure reforms that are underway here, our investment in the capability of regulators, and a bunch of other things that are underway as part of a more holistic strategy on sustainable finance. So overall, there's been a very strong case for us getting more involved, something that ministers have been flagging for a long time, and it's exciting to be with you now in a position for Treasury to take a leading role, working with ASFI and many others to take that agenda forward.
Thank you, Sam. Nicole, when we look in New Zealand at a taxonomy, we tend to look at from the point of view of both New Zealand exporters and what they need to conform to, and the fact that New Zealand is a big capital receiving country, therefore has to appeal to international investors. But I think you've taken a sort of phased approach to the taxonomy in your project work that's a little bit different.
I think not necessarily different. What we really looked at is like Kristy and Sam said, this has sort of been a slow building up for quite some time. And I think, well, slower on the government front as they were sort of getting their heads around this, but really industry was really charging ahead. And I think off the back of particularly COP26, where your key net zero alliances were formed, and our financial institutions were really kind of stepping up to the plate and saying we need to make these commitments, it just became imperative for them to actually get a good handle around what sustainability looks like across their portfolio, so that they can set their net zero targets and they can start to do their transition plans. Like you, we are in the same position of being a net recipient of foreign direct investment, a middle power that is very heavily reliant on sort of the export of our goods and services. And so what we look like matters, and what we do matters to continue to attract the flow of global capital. So the way in which we approach the taxonomy is very conscious of the fact that we needed to ensure interoperability. Like Joe said, we had that key, like we weren't the first, so let's capitalize on that and ensure that we can really learn from all those hard lessons that others have gone before us, but also really grappling with Australia's, and I say every jurisdiction is unique, but Australia's unique circumstances around sort of our quite high emitting energy export sectors, and what we needed to do in order to ensure that finance flowed, not only for sort of our future prosperity as kind of marketing ourselves as green out to 2050, but what are the hard yards that need to happen between now and 2050, and where does capital needed to be allocated along that pathway. And so we were very deliberate in terms of ensuring that we had a broad sector of a cross sector of financial services across Australia that were contributing to this process, that we were actively engaged with our international counterparts. And the first port of call was just, what are others doing? What has worked? What hasn't worked? And what lessons can we learn? And so we did this scoping paper of international taxonomies, and like Kristy said, really engage with our international counterparts who, can I say, were just so collaborative and generous in terms of their time and input that they provided to and really had some honest conversations about sort of what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and how things might be different. And I think what we really picked up is that you can have international interoperability while taking into account country-specific circumstances. There is, I think, a key recognition that each country is starting from a different point, but that we all need to get to the same destination, and that through a robust framework that is credible and science-based, we can all kind of plot the best pathway and the most, science-aligned pathway for each jurisdiction to get there. And so we drew on those lessons internationally and sort of looked at how that would apply to Australia, and we came up with sort of key guiding principles around credibility, usability, interoperability of internationally, and ensuring that we get that prioritization right so that we can drive impact. And noting Australia's unique circumstances, looked at how we can really tackle transition. So we came up with a key set of design principles that would fulfill all of, a key set of design elements that would fulfill all of those principles and actually develop something that was unique for Australia.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Kristy, coming back to you now, is the Australian taxonomy something that people will primarily see as a key reference piece in the discussions around greenwashing, or is it something they'll see as something that is a bureaucratic burden in disclosures and reporting? How do you think people are going to view this? How's ASFI going to make them view it positively?
So I think what you're raising is really critical usability kind of considerations, and this is something that we've learnt very much from the exchanges that we've had with the EU, where usability has been really challenging, and those challenges have come from a number of different places in the EU taxonomy. One is the sequencing of regulations and reporting requirements, and the way that corporate reporting didn't happen before financial institutions were expected to report. But there are a whole lot of factors around the complexity of the do no significant harm approach, and Nicole can talk in a lot more detail about some of the usability challenges that we've seen in the the EU taxonomy in particular, but also that there are many jurisdictions, you know, the UK, the Singaporeans, the Canadians, and ourselves that are looking to improve off, as well as the EU kind of doing ongoing work to improve. But I think what you're highlighting is the need to build in usability right from the beginning, which is something that we've absolutely done in the way that we've made up the technical advisory group, and we'll continue that through the development phase through a technical expert group to ensure that it does achieve the positives in terms of, you know, the suggestion around using the taxonomy to guard against greenwashing, using it as a mandatory disclosure metric, sort of alignment towards the taxonomy, using it to help the credibility of transition plan implementation. There's a range of sort of ways that taxonomies are being used and can be used to underpin the rest of the sustainable finance architecture, but the success of that very much is underpinned by making it usable and fit for purpose in the Australian context. Nicole, I don't know if there's anything you want to add in terms of specifics there.
No, I think you summed it up beautifully.
Okay. Sam, perhaps another question for you. In some of the countries that have brought out taxonomies already, some are voluntary, some are mandatory, some are bits and pieces. Governments tend to like mandatory and not voluntary. That may be a sort of unfair generalization, but how does the Treasury feel about that part of the process?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting discussion, isn't it? I think Kristy's laid out some of the issues well. I think the short answer when it comes to questions about what degree of mandatoriness or voluntariness will there be for a final taxonomy framework in Australia, how it will intersect with other regulatory requirements around greenwashing and disclosure and product labelling. The short answer is we just don't know yet. And the reason for that is because we don't know how close we can get to a taxonomy framework that really is usable, highly credible, strongly aligned with international best practice. Now, obviously, we hope and believe and intend to get there, to get to that point where we've delivered a set of taxonomy criteria that can meet that kind of goal, that overarching imperative of usability, which Kristy has outlined. When we're committed to investing to help to develop the criteria in that direction, but we're also going into that process with our eyes open, acknowledging some of the difficulties that have been faced internationally, some of the lessons that we can learn from that. The first assessment ultimately that we will have to make as the process, the next phase of the process gets underway is how are the draft criteria that we're working away on stacking up with that principle of usability, practicality, alignment in mind. You know, so there's this really interesting kind of theoretical question, for want of a better word, about the right balance between voluntariness and mandatoriness of a taxonomy framework, or where it's incorporated into the regulatory architecture. I think for now anyway, there's an even more interesting practical question about exactly where the kind of criteria and the taxonomy itself can land. Just to go back to that point about usability, and it sounds almost trite to say, it's such an easy thing to say, but like from a Treasury point of view, we agree entirely with the approach that Kristy has outlined, emphasising the importance of making sure the framework is something that can actually be picked up and deployed properly by market participants without being a huge compliance burden and without having huge gaps in the sorts of data and capabilities that are needed to use it. To put it really simply, like we want the taxonomy in Australia and the sustainable finance architecture that we're working on generally to make it easier for people to invest in sustainability aligned activities, easier for firms to manage their portfolios, easier for people to understand what's going on under the hoods in their super funds or whatever else it is. So, you know, that's a core of the approach that we're trying to take, and I think that is strongly informing the design of the next phase of the taxonomy development process, and it's something that we'll be prioritising as we kind of work with ASFI and industry to take those next steps. Just the other thing briefly to say is, you know, we're very much taking a building blocks approach here when it comes to our wider strategy on sustainable finance. The first cab off the rank in Australia has been setting off the process for reforming corporate climate disclosure requirements. We're soon going to be releasing a a second consultation paper outlining some of the specifics of how we see that kind of regime going forward in Australia. At the budget in May, the Treasurer announced a bunch of additional steps to support the wider sustainable finance agenda, so some investment in the capability of ASIC, an announcement that Australia would issue a sovereign green bond, and the initial investment in this taxonomy project. So we're trying to sort of set in motion a few different steps that can come together and crystallise as some of the work is done. But we're at the start of the process now, and it's going to be an evolving, ongoing conversation for the next 6, 12, 18 months, I think.
Okay, thank you, Sam. And Nicole, I'm curious, as you build up the work on the taxonomy, how you manage the social piece of it and how you manage a just transition. Because when we think about taxonomy, we tend to think of climate first, and then go from there. Kanga News, in its sustainable finance report this morning, talks about phase 2 of sustainable finance being biodiversity. It's all an awful lot to take on at once in what we're trying to manage without leaving people behind.
It's a really great question, and something that we've been grappling with both right at the beginning when we were looking at the key design elements. So one of the lessons that our international counterparts said that we really need to heed is that think about the end goal while you're in the design phases. And so one of the questions that we really were asking and working through with our stakeholders is, what is the scope of this? And the overwhelming response was that this needs to be more than climate. And it's not, I think we've even moved beyond sort of these kind of pillars, which is the way it forms itself in the on the piece of paper, but that we actually need to think about how all of these different sustainability objectives intersect with each other. And so we did make a key recommendation that it needed to be broader than climate, that climate, of course, was of high urgency, and we basically got kind of 10 years to really have a good crack at getting ourselves on the transition. And so climate will be the focus, but that it shouldn't be, we shouldn't say climate now, we'll think about everything later. Even though we're focusing on climate now, we need to be considering how this intersects with all the other objectives, in particularly around the environment, around sort of transitioning to a circular economy, but really critically the social elements. And in Australia, we've got, I think, 2 key pillars that we really need to focus on. And I think if we put our heads together, we can actually emerge and hopefully be a leader to others in other jurisdictions. And the one is around sort of, we have large communities that are concentrated in high emitting sectors. And so what does a good just transition look like in our context? And the other one is around sort of, our relationship and engagement with First Nations people, recognizing their rights, recognizing their heritage, and also recognizing the contributions that they can make and how we can integrate that into the considerations that we have. So those are 2 key social elements. And in a taxonomy itself, and sorry to get a bit technical, they usually come through in terms of either as baking in some minimum social safeguards, which doesn't sound very kind of like out there, but it really is just making sure that whatever we do safeguards key social issues. And so I think there is an element of that sits into core labour standards, core standards around human rights, core standards around sort of just what everybody needs to do. And then there's ensuring that we have whatever we do doesn't do any significant harm to anything else. So making sure that as we're considering the transition to renewable energy, for example, that we are embracing and really thinking about what free, prior and informed consent looks like, what meaningful engagement with First Nations people looks like, because a lot of the land that they are managing and are custodians on is land where there will be new renewable energy projects. So really kind of baking that in. But then ultimately getting to the point where we are actually hopefully identifying some positive activities in the social space, which will be, I think, limited, but where we can actually agree on set criteria to drive sustainable outcomes in those social elements. To what extent can we actually develop out the taxonomy there? So while we will focus in the first instance on getting climate even in our initial planning, we're looking across all of those, and we're thinking about making sure that as we build in, that we're not having to retrofit, but that it's actually just going to be a continuing and a growth of the taxonomy over time.
Okay, thank you. You've all talked eloquently and extensively about interoperability, usability, and just now about the transition. Just before we open up for questions, if there's one thing you could tell New Zealand that we should watch for, what lesson would that be from your experience? Kristy, do you want to go first?
I would say don't feel like you're doing it alone. And I think that's the biggest thing that we've taken from, and Nicole's talked to sort of the collaboration we've had with other jurisdictions, but it can seem big and daunting and technically challenging, but there is so much goodwill from the doers across other jurisdictions, as well as sort of the government parties across other jurisdictions as well. So I think that's the biggest takeout from my perspective. There's a great community that you can kind of do this work alongside and with.
Okay, thank you. Sam, what do you think?
I don't think we're in the business of handing out lessons just yet, but I think just from a Treasury point of view, I think one thing that's been really important and meaningful for us has been just strengthening coordination on these issues across government departments and particularly across the financial regulators. So I think there's been a concerted effort from Treasury to work more closely with ASIC and APRA and the Reserve Bank in the Australian context, as well as some of our colleagues in other government departments federally. I think in particular that alignment across the financial regulatory community and having a really strong process to work through some of these issues and think about how reforms could be sequenced and map out the different kind of dynamics across different parts of the financial regulatory system has been really useful. And, you know, ideally, hopefully that's something that's already firmly in place on that side of the Tasman, but that investing in that that coordination has been a really important part of us having a more coherent approach overall, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Nicole, one lesson for New Zealand?
I think building off both what Kristy and Sam have said, which I think are variations of the same thing, is that this is actually quite a new and unique area and space that the world is trying to shift into in terms of actually shifting our economic systems to consider something broader than what we were previously considering. And we cannot do this alone. And so it's not just around sort of, I mean, agreeing with Kristy, we have you have friends in the international community, you have friends across different areas of government that need to come together, and then across the financial services sector. So getting that kind of buy-in and consensus around these key issues and actually forming an environment where the financial services sector can actually engage in a meaningful way with our regulators and our Treasury, and then equally we can collectively engage internationally. You need all of those parties at the table to actually make this effective and make it usable and make it credible. So just draw on those. It's interdisciplinary. We need cooperation, but I think we actually need more than that. We need partnership, and we actually need to kind of think about new ways of doing things together. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. I don't see a large number of questions in the chat yet. I'm sure they're coming, but and I've also got restricted view of the chat. But one thing that struck me from something Sam said a minute ago, you know, our Reserve Bank has been very active in the Greening the Financial System initiative, which was started by a number of central banks, and that seemed to be a step in intergovernment collaboration to a greater degree than we'd seen in many cases before. Do you see industry and private sector bodies stepping up in the same way as governments are in trying to push more collaboration?
I might jump in there first.
Any of the three of you, sorry.
Feel free to jump in. Entirely. And I think the big watershed moment, I guess, or the big public kind of demonstration of that was the establishment of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero out of COP26. And I think before then there had been sectoral specific kind of alliances around net zero across the finance sector. But what that was saying whether you're a bank, whether you're an investor, whether you're an asset manager, an asset consultant, an insurer, there is a role for all of these different parts of finance in achieving the net zero future that governments and collectively globally we have agreed to. And GFANZ and the work that they're doing about the role of the finance sector in supporting net zero, I think is a fantastic demonstration of that global level collaboration. I think what we are seeing now in lots of jurisdictions is, you know, the CSF plays this role in New Zealand and ASFI and others play this role in Australia, is much more collaboration, not just across finance, but across the private sector with government. And I think that's, to Nicole's point, one of the most exciting parts about this development phase of the taxonomy is it's really, it's more than just a contract from government to ASFI to do the technical development work. It's very much a partnership, and a partnership in terms of governance and strategy and the way that this work will happen. And I think, yeah, given the scale and complexity of the challenges that this type of work is trying to address, that's exactly the partnership models that are needed for this. And I think, yeah, that's happening not just within the private sector, but between private and public sectors, which is what's most exciting, I think.
I'd also, if perhaps challenge is too strong a word, but GFANZ in some ways has illustrated in the arguments that have existed within the GFANZ movement that it's too expensive, we can't afford to do this. The Dutch farmers' reaction to their government's edict on reducing dairy herds. There's been some pretty healthy debate that has meant the traffic's not all one way without any question.
Entirely agree. And it's easy to make high level commitments. It's really difficult when you get to the implementation part of it. And that's when the metal gets tested and you see domestic politics kind of playing into the ability of different firms to remain part of those global collaborative initiatives. But I think on the whole, they provide a great framework and sort of alignment in terms of purpose and objectives, and then obviously how individual jurisdictions and how individual companies or organisations then implement those commitments will differ. But I think what you see from some of those is sort of a public recognition that collaboration is valuable and useful, and that's a very different place from where we were 5-10 years ago.
Okay, thank you, Kristy. We've had two questions come in on the chat. The first one, I think, Nicole, perhaps for you. How's the Australian government's focus and work on biodiversity interacting with the work on the taxonomy?
Yeah. No, it's a really great question. So I'll answer it maybe in two parts. The one is around, I guess, in general, the Australian government is pursuing really ambitious agenda in a number of areas which would intersect with the taxonomy. And so we are definitely looking to see how we can integrate and incorporate the government policy work into sort of the building blocks of the taxonomy and creating a sort of an official channel to do that. So that's, I guess, at a high level, particularly with regards to biodiversity, the foundational work that the Australian government is doing right now is going to be absolutely critical to even enabling Australia to develop key technical screening criteria for the environmental objectives, right? Because we need to get to a point of having a strong baseline for Australia. We need to get to a point of having a really downloading what was agreed in Montreal in December around the key targets, which Australia really played a very, I guess, positive role in terms of getting to that point of agreement. So all of those targets need to get translated, and in that translation, that creates, I guess, a hook or an endpoint for us to be able to say, what does good look like? Where are we starting from, and and then we can start to look at the key activities along that will help us get from where we are to where we need to be. And without those, I guess, foundational elements, it's very difficult to actually kind of put up an environmental stream for a taxonomy. There are not many jurisdictions. In fact, even the EU, people think that, oh, they've got criteria for everything. They don't. Even the environmental criteria is draft criteria, and they have to grapple with their own baselines and their own endpoints. So, unlike climate, where we got that baseline of net zero and we got that, that endpoint of limiting 1.5, you don't have that in the environment. And so this ambitious agenda from the government around biodiversity and the the enabling work that they're doing at the moment is just going to be the building blocks that we need to get there for, you know, developing criteria for the environment.
And Australia's very prominent in the TNFD discussions, which I think really helps it in that part of the debate. The other question that's come in, and perhaps Sam, you'd like to take a first shot at this. New Zealand would be starting at quite a different place than Australia, given our already predominantly renewable grid. Would you have, or would any of you, but let's start with you, Sam, have any thoughts on how this difference might come out in a taxonomy?
Sure, I can have a first crack at that one, and I might go back at the end just to that question about nature and biodiversity as well, because I think it's a really interesting one. I'm really interested in Kristy and Nicole's view on this one, actually. I mean, one of the obvious differences as a starting point is in that question of which sectors get prioritised for the development of screening criteria. You know, we're kind of working through that process now in Australia, figuring out where that initial impetus is, where the initial focus is. And as was the case in ASFI's scope, and in the scoping stage of the process, there's a range of kind of criteria that we're all considering when trying to make that selection, from things like the economic size and significance of the sector, its role in just transitions, the existence of, you know, existing frameworks which can be built into a set of taxonomy criteria. So there's quite a complicated series of, well, not complicated, but there's an important series of considerations when it comes to identifying which sectors are most important. I think the overarching one is probably the contribution that particular sectors need to make to the overall transition and the role we see for each sector in driving that transition. Now, obviously, that might look a bit different in the case of energy in Australia than it does in New Zealand. In some ways, that means being able to, if not sidestep, then perhaps get less caught up in some of the really tricky threshold issues about the parts of the energy mix, and what the different parts of the energy mix need to look like going forward. Noting that some of those questions about the role of particular fuels and generation technologies, etc., have been the things which have been very tricky to manage, both in terms of taxonomy development internationally and just managing public policy around these issues generally. So perhaps that's one kind of positive. I suspect you sidestep those difficulties straight into another set of difficulties, because those tensions and trade-offs and political kind of hurdles exist in any sector realistically. So it's not like you get you can maneuver easily around the pitfalls in one particular sector and you get a rails run across the rest of them. I think they exist everywhere, but maybe that's one kind of difference in the starting point for New Zealand. Just to go back really quickly to the question on nature and biodiversity, and completely endorse how Nicole framed the role of nature-related considerations in the taxonomy context, and also Nicole's earlier framing about how the importance of building in this view about the role of biodiversity, circular economy, First Nations issues, etc., right at the outset of the taxonomy development process, instead of it being a kind of plug-in or add-on later. The point I wanted to reiterate is we want to take that same approach, not just across the taxonomy specifically, but across the approach to sustainable finance generally. So we're thinking very actively about the medium-term evolution of the corporate disclosure requirement framework, for instance, in a way that can, from the outset, be designed to incorporate new global standards on nature and on other things as they come online and come into the mix. And there are a range of other parts of sustainable finance where it's also important to take that view about the role of nature and biodiversity and other issues right from the outset. So hopefully that's something that you see come across pretty clearly right across the strategy that we're working on, not just on the taxonomy side of things.
Okay, thank you, Sam. There's one other question in the chat on your thinking on DNSF, whether you would look to follow the EU in this. I don't know which of you would like to take that.
I'm happy to take that one since it's a bit down in the weeds. So, I mean, DNSF, I think there's no secret it has been very difficult from a usability point of view. And I think even from the EU recognizing that it's complex, they've they published, the EU Platform for Sustainable Finance published a 167-page report on data and usability that focused very heavily on do no significant harm criteria and how it can be streamlined, made better, made more usable. So I think the other thing to note about do no significant harm criteria for the EU is it's very focused on the EU. It is very specific to EU laws. It references, thousands of kind of lines around kind of key standards that are baked into EU law. And so I think by just the very nature, a country couldn't just pick up and do the same, or pick up the EU do no significant harm criteria and apply it. It just would not be relevant. But I think even more so, learning from sort of that first initial, the EU were the first to have a go, and they tried, and now they learned a lot of those lessons, is that you have other jurisdictions, particularly the UK, who were obviously involved in the initial process with the EU taxonomy, and now are looking at really what they can onshore and what they can kind of make specific to the UK, is that they've done significant work on kind of filing that down and being very specific around sort of how you could make do no significant harm criteria, more fit for purpose for the jurisdiction that it's in, but also more sort of usable and easy to digest. And they'll be publishing a report in the next couple of weeks, which we will be kind of eagerly awaiting. But we've been having ongoing discussions with them around, okay, how could Australia do a similar approach? And I think there's also been a paper that's been published in the Singapore jurisdiction that's also currently out for consultation on their approach to do no significant harm. And both the UK approach, which will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, as well as the Singaporean approach, are just taking a lot more of a pragmatic view around usability for do no significant harm, and ensuring that it is a bit more fit for purpose. So I think while we all agree that do no significant harm is an important element of taxonomies, I think we will definitely be learning the lessons and being focusing on usability and seeing what we can draw on from our other jurisdictions in terms of the work that they're doing there.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. We're almost out of time, and I'm due to I want to turn it back to Kristy to talk about what's next for ASFI. But there is one interesting question here, which I'd like her, perhaps Kristy, you pick this up with your comments. The question is that in New Zealand, we're seeing government partnering in transition or adaptation efforts becoming highly politicized, and the benefits then being lost in the reporting. So in Australia, where does the onus of education and upskilling on the benefits of government investment sit? Now, I first thought about throwing that to Sam, but it's perhaps a little bit unfair to ask the Treasury to answer the question direct. So Kristy, perhaps, and bring Sam in if you like, but what's your perspective on that question? And then what's next for ASFI?
Sure, and without understanding the full context, I'm guessing there's a lot behind that question, which I'm not fully across. So more than happy, David, if you want to provide any additional kind of context, or I'll just jump in.
I think that the debate around what we're spending, what we need to spend, who's benefiting from the amount of money the government's chipping into sustainability is not as clear, perhaps, as in Australia, because we have a system at the moment where blended finance, for instance, isn't as understood as it is in other markets, where the corporate relationships and what the corporates are contributing is a subject for debate. So there's a perhaps rabbit in the headlights thing from the market generally, saying, look at the costs we're facing with all this, it's not worth it. Why is the government not doing this? Why is it doing that? So there's not a clear explanation of accountability, which I think we perhaps need to be better at in New Zealand. And that's why I think the question of where does the onus of education and upskilling on the benefits of government investment sit? We would see that as our role in Toitū Tahua primarily, and I think you probably see it as ASFI's role.
Yeah, and I think this whole question of where is blended finance the right tool to accelerate investment into the transition, for example, or to bring private capital into better management of climate risk is a really interesting one. And blended finance is not the only tool either. I think in the Australian context, we've had the Clean Energy Finance Corporation was 10 years old last year. So there is both strong understanding within different parts of government. The CEFC is not the only blended finance approach. Government also has sort of a bond aggregator for the social and affordable housing space. There are a number of different blended finance vehicles that government use to catalyse private capital for strategic objectives and different objectives. So there is probably a longer history and understanding of that catalytic role, and probably the capability to think about additionality and where that makes sense and where that doesn't, and where some of the other policy and regulatory levers are more appropriate to shift, I guess, rules of the game or market, market rules essentially. So I wouldn't say that we've necessarily got all the answers in Australia, but it is, I think, part of having those institutions within the market and a growing cohort of investors and banks and others who have co-invested or invested alongside them. But I also don't want to suggest that that discussion and those decisions aren't very challenging either, when there's climate-related disasters and areas becoming uninsurable. There's a whole lot of really complex systemic challenges that we're in a very similar position to New Zealand on as well on that front. I won't throw Sam in that because I suspect it's that does consume the efforts right across a range of different parts of government, and Treasury is very much through the sustainable finance strategy bringing a coordinated both financial sector regulator and whole of government view into these challenges. But it cuts across many different portfolios. In terms of where ASFI is going, as we've talked about today, so the taxonomy is a flagship project, but it sits within this broader government sustainable finance strategy, and Sam sort of mentioned some of the foundational elements of that. I think the green bond framework that is being developed for the green bonds program that Australia will start next year can play a really important role in leading the market in Australia, and there's a lot of investor and finance sector interest in that. And I think the other element that Sam didn't get a chance to mention of the sustainable finance strategy is the international partnerships and how sustainable finance plays an increasing role in Australia's partnerships, particularly with the region and with those countries that have a very aligned interest in transition finance and attracting more finance for transition, making sure that we are part of some of those global international conversations around transition finance in particular. The other area in terms of ASFI's broad policy and enabling environment work, Nicole mentioned the environmental reforms that are underway. There was also an announcement through the budget process that a new net zero authority is being established in Australia with a mandate to both support workers, support regions and communities, but also to help investors and companies engage within that net zero transformation opportunities. So that will be a really critical piece of the institutional architecture on the government side, and I think, again, an opportunity for close collaboration with different parts of the private sector as well, which is getting stood up from the 1st of July. And ultimately our interests as ASFI in all of these sort of policy and regulatory discussions are how can the policy environment support greater allocation of capital towards a net zero, nature positive, inclusive Australia. So that's sort of the lens with which we engage in all of these things. On the natural capital side, we talked a little bit about international disclosure rules and TNFD, which will be finalised later this year, and ASFI is providing sort of a finance sector usability perspective view into those global discussions, but also very much working, I would say, bottom up with our banking and other members to help them to integrate natural capital considerations into financial decision making. So again, very much focusing on making things happen and using a range of different approaches and levers to do that. The last thing I will mention, which is related to the questions around the social aspects of the taxonomy, is the work that we're doing on First Nations and finance. And in the same way that climate and nature related disclosures are really driving a lot more strategic thinking and a reshaping of the way that corporates and financial institutions are managing those risks and investing in opportunities, we're looking at how we might work with our members and others to improve disclosures around First Nations related risks and opportunities, ultimately to support better outcomes for First Nations Australians.
Okay, I'm afraid that's about all we've got time for. So Kristy, Sam and Nicole, thank you all very much indeed. It was a really interesting discussion. We raised a number of topics that on their own could easily take a webinar. The one around interoperability and usability, the whole issue of the transition and safeguards, the whole issue around do no significant harm, biodiversity and what's coming in nature. And then just as Kristy was talking a couple of minutes ago, somebody asked, is there a risk for smaller economies doing a bespoke taxonomy when international investors may say, oh, we're not going to get our hands on all of these small taxonomies, everybody has to conform to a certain standard, and that on its own could be another interesting discussion. So I look forward to us continuing this session of webinars on the experience different countries have had and how it all applies to us in New Zealand, and hopefully coming up with some sensible answers at the end of this series. So thank you all again very much indeed. I'm just going to go to David Tikau to close with a karakia, but could I also ask the speakers to stay online when the call ends, because we'd like to take a screenshot for everybody. So thank you all again. David, over to you.
Kia ora, David. E karakia, kia whakapapa mu te moana, kia ore te marino, kia pai te hari I te ao, haumi e, hui e, tā kie. Kia ora.
Kia ora, David. Thank you.
Kia ora.